This episode of the Education Matters podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Mental Health Summit, taking place from April 10th to the 12th at the Banff Center in Banff, Alberta. We're diving into important conversations at the intersection of education and mental well-being. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri, and for this special episode, I'm joined by guest host, Dr. Gina Jarkowski. Together, we'll explore how education can support mental health and empower learners in meaningful ways. So let's get started.
And so we are now, Adam Grant says this, we're playing by a set of rules that was established for a world that no longer exists. We are, as big people, overwhelmed, exhausted. There is no time for our educators to refuel because their students, their staff, their administrators can get them anytime. The body keeps the score.
Education has never just been about academics. Schools, at their core, are places where human beings learn to navigate the world. They learn how to think, how to interact, and socialize with each other. They learn how to handle success and failure. But in a time when teachers are stretched thin, students are facing unprecedented mental health challenges, and entire systems are struggling to keep up. One of the key questions that keeps coming up in my conversations with educators, superintendents, and parents is, how do we take care of the people who take care of our kids? And today's guest is the perfect person to help us answer this question. I'm very excited to present you with Dr. Jody Carrington. Jody is a psychologist, best-selling author, and speaker known for her ability to make complex human challenges feel simple, because as she believes at the heart of it, they often are. Jody has spent her career helping educators, first responders, and leaders understand the power of connection. In her latest book, Feeling Seen, she explores what it takes to reconnect in a disconnected world. Her message is as clear as it is urgent. We are wired to do hard things, but we were never meant to do them alone. In this conversation, we dive into Jody's childhood and the moment that inspired her to become a psychologist. We discuss topics such as the crisis facing education today, burnout, emotional exhaustion, and the loneliness epidemic that's driving it. We talk about why schools need to focus not only on student well-being, but also prioritize investing in the adults in the building. We explore the profound impact of small moments, of teachers, bus drivers, and coaches who make their kids feel like they matter. And we unpack why some of the most powerful lessons in resilience don't come from a curriculum, but from the sidelines of a basketball court or a quiet moment in the hallway, and most times come from a caring and supportive teacher. If you are intrigued by questions surrounding mental health or loneliness or what it means to be a human in a world that often forgets how much we need each other, this conversation is for you. This is Education Matters, and I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. So let's get into it. Dr. Jody Carrington and Dr. Gina Jarkowski, welcome to the podcast. At this stage, I would have given you both a proper introduction, but perhaps we can start with an overview of what you're currently working on. Gina, if you don't mind, let's start with you. Can you let me know where you are and what you're working on lately?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jason. Excited to be here with you and Dr. Jody. I'm excited about the work we're doing on mental health in schools. We've got a research project that we did, and next year we'll be scaling it up to work with 20 additional schools across the province of Alberta and doing impact research on the work we're doing and the programs we're bringing into schools. So I'm super excited about that. And of course, what's taking most of my time is the Mental Health Summit, which is going to be epic. And I'm so excited on that note that Dr. Jody Carrington has agreed to be our keynote speaker, and very excited to chat with her today and talk about all the things that she's doing to support mental health and well-being for both little people and big people.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gina. Jody, welcome to the podcast. Where does this podcast find you?
Oh my gosh. Thank you for having me. I'm on Treaty 7 land this morning here in Old Alberta, Canada. And snowy, trying to stay warm. This is home for me and I'm rarely here. So today is one of those days. It feels so good to be back.
Well, and for those that are just listening and not seeing this on YouTube, you have a beautiful setup, which I'm very, as a podcast host myself, I'm very, very envious of. But thank you so much, Jody, for joining us. As we always do on the Education Matters podcast, I'd love to start with your background. Can you tell the audience where and when you grew up?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love this part of my story. I don't know if anybody opens with that, but anyway, okay. Listen, I am a psychologist, a child psychologist. I spent a lot of time with kids. That's not how it started. I'm not a huge fan of kids. I much prefer big people. I have 3 of my own, so I'm kind of coming around, but I'm much prefer big people. And I often say, you know, the work that I do, I have a PhD in clinical psychology, all started because of a teacher. So I grew up in Viking, Alberta, Canada, home of the Sutter brothers, 7 boys, 6 make the NHL. I tried to marry a Sutter, didn't work out, which is fine. I got a farmer, but anyway. And I often say this, like, I can tell you the first and last name of every teacher I had. My bus driver's name was Stan Chomik, a crotchety son of a bitch, and he picked us up every day from grade 3, dropped us home every grade to grade 12, and I loved him. And the administrative support personnel was Ev McLaren and Judy Fitzmaurice Simmons. They were there my whole 13 years of post-secondary or of education. Loved them. And my favorite teacher's name was Mrs. Holly Nordstrom. And I don't know. So there's 22 of us that started kindergarten together. The same 19 of us graduated together. And I cannot tell you a single piece of literacy or numeracy that I learned in those 12 years. Okay. Not one time. Not one time. But I do remember where Mrs. Nordstrom was standing and what she was wearing the day she had to tell us the then captain of our hockey team had been killed. And I remember thinking, even as a 16-year-old kid, if the big people are okay, the little people will be just fine. When big emotion is at the table, there needs to be an anchor. There needs to be somebody that can right the ship, that can keep us pointed in the right direction, particularly when we don't have a script for it. And I remember being so struck by her capacity to do that in a day where, you know, all of us, I would argue, didn't have a script for that. And when I went home that night, I said to my dad, I know what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to be like Mrs. Nordstrom. And he was like, because I was drinking excessively in the Kinsella gravel pits at that point, because that's what you do in small town Alberta. You find a great big hole where the Royal Canadian Mounted Police can't find you, and you try to get a husband. But anyway, so he was so excited that I would have a career goal. He was like, oh my God, you want to be a teacher? And I was like, no, I don't like kids. I want to be a psychologist. I want to make people feel the way Mrs. Nordstrom made us feel that day. And so that started a big journey in this process. And I ended up doing my undergrad at the U of A. And then I had an opportunity to become a civilian member of our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our national police force for a couple of years. And I started to learn really quickly about organizations and stress and what it looks like when organizations don't look after their people. We do a really poor job in this country of looking after first responders. And so I started to get really invested in this idea of trauma and mental health and organizational stress. So I did my master's, my PhD. And then my residency was in Nova Scotia, and they said, you have to do a rotation with kids. And I was like, listen, not a fan. And they're like, you are kind of like one. We think you'd be a good fit. So I fell in love with the tiny humans, and I dove deep for a whole extra year on the neurodevelopment of babies and the sort of influence of trauma and family systems. And I just fell in love with this idea of the systemic approach to understanding behavior. And so my first job was on a locked psychiatric inpatient unit for kids at the Alberta Children's Hospital. The hitters, the kickers, the biters, the ones that tied F off. I love those babies. And mostly because we ask the wrong questions. They taught me this so early. We always ask, what is wrong? What is wrong? He got the ADHD, he got the bipolar, he got the LD, he's a hitter, he's a kicker, he's a biter. What are his motivators and triggers? And nobody asks this question. We all want to know what's wrong here, but nobody asks what happened here. And when we switch that question from what is wrong here, what happens here, suddenly we have the evocation of empathy, and empathy is the antidote to burnout. So the past decade of my career has really been focused mostly in the space of those doing the work of regulating other people, teachers primarily, police officers, and now we do lots more work in the corporate space, in leadership, trying to figure out if the big people aren't okay, the little people don't stand a chance. And in education, particularly where I've spent a lot of my career, that I think is the greatest investment any agency or government can make. And for the rest of my career will be in education. In fact, I spoke at the United Nations ahead of the General Assembly this year in New York. And the question was, how do we address a mental health crisis? And, my primary response is you invest in teachers, not in kids. Kids are not the problem. So it's that's where we're at. I've written a few books about it and I speak about it 100 times a year. And it's just, I think the answer is so simple.
Well, I mean, there's so many different directions I want to go there. But we're going to certainly spend the majority of this conversation talking about your work and your approach, which I think is fascinating. And I have, fortunately, another expert here with me to help me ask some of those questions. But if I can ask you to linger a moment longer on your childhood, what and how did you play as a child?
What and how did I play? Oh my gosh. Sports were a big deal in our house. So we grew up on a farm, and it's in Feeling Seen, which is the last book. I tell the story of knowing I thought my whole life I was the oldest in my family of two. And we learned later that I'm in fact the middle child, which is still disappointing to me actually. And my parents, I have a full biological sibling, a sister that neither my brother and I, nor nobody on this planet knew except my mom and dad. They gave up my sister for adoption when they got pregnant just after high school. And they couldn't tell anybody. They bound, my mom bound her belly, and my father found a home for unwed mothers and snuck her there. And they were told that they could never find my sister. And they didn't. And when I was 38, the adoption records had been unsealed, I think in 2010, no, earlier. And she then started looking for us and so found us. So before that, I guess there was always a little bit of a piece now in retrospect that was missing. There was a sadness about, my mom that now makes more sense to me. And I think, I relatively speaking, very privileged, very connected. The community, I played hockey and, we had cows, and this small community still just, the second I drive back into it, it just feels safe to me. So I had the privilege of experiencing a lot of safe people growing up. And as I now know, that's one of the greatest predictors of well-being is when you have a safe place to land. And so I had that a lot. And and I still, Dad's still back there, Kurt's still back there. So it's good.
That's a wonderful and powerful story. I also read that you've done a lot of work with athletes and teams and in sports psychology. It's been an emergent theme on this podcast that a lot of the guests of leaders of districts and tech companies have this, propensity to play sports and to be part of teams, young and committed. Is there anything in the work you've done that has that you've identified anything about how good sports are? And I mean, it doesn't have to be a sport, right? It could be dance. It could be these kind of collective and physical activities. And anything that you would comment on there for the audience?
Yeah, you can't tell anybody how to be great. You got to show them. So you can in your head talk all the time about what I need you to do to be a leader or to be a good teammate or to not yell at a referee. You know all those things when you're emotionally regulated. You have to be in those positions. The chaos is necessary to learn the calm. So I think the most recent data would say that 84% of any successful female leader played organized sports as a child. And the indication there for me doesn't have necessarily anything to do with the sport, rather than understanding how to connect on a human level with people when stuff becomes difficult. So we make a big mistake, I think, with our kids, particularly these days. We just want everybody to be happy. And this is the indication from a strict behavioral model. We want to keep people calm. We want to keep people happy. And if, people who come into my practice say, or I would ask them, they would say, can you see my kid? I'm so worried. We're going through a divorce, or they got this. I think they got this. And I always say, yes, my gosh, I would love to see your kid, but I need to see you first. And the question often is, what do you mean? Do you think I'm the problem? And I'm always like nodding my head and saying, no, of course you're not the problem. You're the solution. Because if you don't have that safety net, that safe place to land, to make sense of hard things when they come, not if, we will not have a script to handle it when they do. And so what sports provides more than, I mean, and you're right, at any organized, even basket weaving, rodeo, playing pool, Dungeons and Dragons, hockey, all the things, it provides us a sense of sort of making sense of conflict. What happens when we're disappointed or we're rejected or we're not picked or we lose the big game or we win the big game. My biggest wish for every kid is that they're not happy all the time, because that's dumb. None of us are happy all the time, but that you have a script for all of the emotions and you have the capacity to feel them deeply. And where you get a really good teaching ground is in sport.
From your mouth to the ears of the parents in my community.
And also that's where parents tend to learn how to regulate emotion. I have never seen more assholery-ish parents in the history of the free world than I have in this moment, because you put a dad who thinks his kid's going to the dub in some U9B tier 677 game. So I've invested a lot of time with coaches and offering resources for coaches, because I think it's a really underserviced part and a very critical part. If you have the privilege to coach a minor team in any capacity, school-based or in your community, it is holy work. You are woven into the trajectory of so many kids' lives, and we do very little to invest in the emotional regulation of those people. Because they say, I mean, we're volunteers, we're giving up our weekends, we're spending time and money and energy, which is we're very grateful for, but you can destroy a kid and you can save them. And when you understand that the part about winning or losing is really irrelevant, that when you understand the power of nicknames, when you understand the importance of meeting kids outside the dressing room, of high fives and tying skates and fill in water bottles, it is estimated that our great grandparents looked at their children 72% more of the time than we look at our babies today. So when I am tying skates and I hear a dad with the best intentions say, like, those kids got to learn how to tie their skates. They're 13, they're 9, they're whatever. And I say, I know, Dad. I'm not worried about their ability to tie skates. What I want to know is that they know that they matter this morning. And if I can fill them up in this dressing room and tie their skates, they're going to go out there and give me their best shot today. Right? This isn't about coddling them. This is really about making sure that some big person got their eyes today. And so there's so much opportunity on a basketball bench, on a volleyball court, to find the good in kids and then direct them in that order. And there's very little training support for people who commit such a big chunk of their lives to spending time with our babies. And so, one of my biggest involvements in this space of sport, mostly because I love it. I play it, I coach it. I love everything. Hockey's my number one, but I'll watch lawn bowling if you give me somebody to cheer for. I just think one of our greatest investments can be in minor organizations, volunteer organizations, and supporting the people who are committed. And I'm grateful enough that they would give time to our community. We need more of that, but they also need to know that they matter.
Well, as a AAA baseball coach here in Ontario, I am clipping that and I am sending it to my association.
Listen, I got a whole course I'll send you to your association. This is what I did, Jay. I put it, like, I would do this talk and, I had people come and I just saved it. And then just before Christmas, I was like, hey, take it for free. We had 100,000 people signing up for this 60 minutes on how to regulate emotion. I taught them about the lid flip. And that gives you and me, if we're in a AAA baseball team and you got some dad that thinks his kid's going all the way and you got some mom that's crying in the corner, you could be like, okay, listen, look at me. She's just flipping her lid. Let's get her a snack. We're going to be okay. Huh? Then we're going to get back. You lose access to all of your pitching trials. You lose access to all of your batting practice when you're dysregulated. So it doesn't matter how much I invest in that. If I have a coach who flips his lid because the ump made a bad call. Maybe you have to cut that. I mean, made a bad call.
You're going to roll with it.
You made a bad call. Then that kid's going to lose his mind. Now, those babies have just lost access to everything that we have created, not their ability. They've lost access to it. So I got to bring that big guy back home, and then I can bring the babies on the bench home. So the greatest investment actually of all time is not in the kids. It's in the coaching staff.
Jody, I can do a 3-hour podcast on sports and mental health. And that is actually one of my dreams, to have someone like
Done.
you walk
Done.
it through. I of course want to turn this conversation to education, but maybe even before we get there, let me kick it over to Gina for any questions she might have about some of your work, so we can give the audience some background in that, and then we'll come back to the education piece.
Sure. I would love to talk a little bit more about the emotional illness that is absolutely outpacing cancer and other things, leading cause of death for humans these days. And so I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit more on emotional illness, and then talk about what can we do in our schools, both for the big people and the little people, to help support that.
Okay. Yeah. Beautiful question. We are, for the first time in history, we are dying faster from emotional illness than we are from physical illness, as you mentioned, which is a conundrum for many of us, because we've never had this much access to resources and research and understanding on how, we operate as humans, yet we've never been this disconnected. And the question then becomes, we've seen an uptick for sure in adolescent mental health issues, but in anxiety, depression across the board. We've never seen levels of burnout this high across organization. 50% of all people across organization globally would say, I'm experiencing burnout at any given time. That's a big concern. And suicide rates continue to rise. And so people often ask me, and I'm sure they ask you, Gina, what is happening with this mental health crisis? And, my response is this: I don't think we're in a mental health crisis. I think we're in an understandable human response to a loneliness epidemic. Because there are two rules of this human race that we will never, this is how it is. This is the two rules of the human race. Number one, we're neurobiologically wired for connection. You disconnect from an infant, they die. We will not automate relationship, no matter how sexy ChatGPT gets or how much AI you implement into the classroom or into your human resources. The only AI that will matter in successful human-centered places is authentic interaction. Full stop. So whoever made us said, I'm going to make you as humans neurobiologically wired for connection. You will do better if you stay connected to each other, okay? And the second rule was a curveball. Whoever made us said, I'm going to make you neurobiologically wired for connection, but the hardest thing you will ever do is look at each other. And so now we're in this very interesting space where we've never had so many opportunities to look away. We've never had so many exit ramps. We need each other desperately. We're lonely. 50%, 1 in 2 in every classroom in this moment above the age of 13 would say, in the last 7 days, I don't know if anybody really cares about me. 1 in 2.
Jody, can I double click on something there?
Yeah. Gina's like, what?
Well, I'll come back to that, but the idea of not being able to look at each other, or this turning our gaze away from each other, is it an evolutionary adaptation? Is there some understanding behind that? I actually haven't heard that before.
Mm-hmm. So when you feel incompetent or not confident, where are your eyes?
To the ground.
When you're struggling with grief, or you're in grief or mourning or trauma, where's your eyes? If somebody's told you you're a piece of shit your whole life, you don't matter because your skin is of a different color, you grew up in a different country, you don't have the same skill set, you're not able-bodied, any of those things, where's your eyes? Down. And so these are the window to the soul. And when kids in particular, any humans, have been supported and connected, they have the capacity much more to look. Now, people will argue with me all the time about cultural differences and, what if the baby's on the spectrum, all those things. Even, kids on the spectrum need to socially reference, and they use their eyes to do that. So if you have the visual capacity, this becomes critical. And oftentimes, what we'll do at the summit is this interesting activity where, I get people to look at each other. Because you think it's hard, you're fine, we're connected, we have people who love us. How hard can it be to look at each other? It is ridiculous, particularly when we love each other. Anon started this set of research out of Singapore, and I just love it because his only protocol is to get people to look at each other for 4 minutes. And I was reading it and I was like, how hard can this be? I mean, my personal husband and I have been married for 15 years. I mean, obviously he wants to look at me. So I came home and I said to him, hey, listen, I was reading this research and it's called the 4 minutes of connection. So all we have to do really, honey, is just like sit down and look at each other for 4 minutes. Like, are you up for it? And you know what he said to me? Why? And I was like, whoa. What do you friggin' mean? Why? Like, first of all, I had a lot of choices in 2009. Okay. And secondly, I mean, look at me, you lucky son of a gun. And so he's a feedlot nutritionist by training. He's a scientist. So he's like, okay, fine, I'll do it, but I have to time it. Like, we're not like, God forbid we go over the
4.5 minutes, right?
Minutes. Like, so he sits on the couch, I sit on the couch, starts the timer, and like we're 6 seconds in, and he calls a big T. Time. And I was like, what do you mean time? Time out. And he said, I just have a question. Like, what am I looking for specifically? Like, did you get a haircut? Is this a new shirt? I was like, holy
You thought it was a test. You thought it was a test?
Jesus. Yeah, truly. So, I mean, it was interesting. I had a group of farmers. I was just telling you guys before we started this, in Huatuco, Mexico, doing some training, and like, gosh, kindest humans on the planet. And I said, watch what happens when we're here. I want you to watch what happens when you pass anybody in the hallway, when you're on the elevator. Like, we're in a relaxed place here. Most of us feel lucky to be here. We're in privileged positions. Watch how many people look at each other. Very few. If you want to get us in a stressed environment, like you're walking downtown Toronto, or you're heading into the school in the morning, or, in a city, when you're driving, would anybody ever wave at each other? No, you think they've been drinking. You know what I mean? Like, if you go to work and you're just giving your neighbor the old 1-2, like, they're like, what is going on with Jason? Huh? And so you just think about this. Like, I always reference this too. Like, when we grew up in a small town, like, if you didn't wave to somebody when you're driving down the street, like, and it didn't have to be like gregarious, like my personal husband, like, waves with like one finger or two fingers, like, if you really know somebody, then you give them the old, two like this. But like, you stop immediately when you get to a new community or when you get into the city. You're not doing that anymore. And it begs the question, right? We get really stuck into our own heads. And when you do say to somebody, hi, or, oh my gosh, I love your shirt, Gina, or, oh, I saw your kid yesterday at the ball field, man, I just wanted to tell you, Dad, I don't know what you're doing, but you're doing something right. You say those things, and it's like you pull their prefrontal cortex on first, right? So it's like a bit of voodoo magic, and you get them back to the best parts of themselves. But if we think we're doing that less and less and less because we're stuck in our own heads, because we don't have the skill, we'd rather text somebody, then our babies are not watching us do that. And you can't give away something you've never received.
That was awesome. I find that absolutely fascinating. That was, I love ideas, and you just gave me a whole new. I mean, part of me thinks that the sort of biological inheritance is a dominance play, right? Like, you see it in a lot of other species that the person who controls the gaze is the dominant personality, or in the dominant position in the group. And then I find it fascinating. I never thought of this, that we always tend, right, I guess within a spectrum, to avert our eye contact, and now we have all kinds of excuses to be comfortable in averting our eye contact. Never thought of it. It's brilliant.
And bigger spaces, Jay. Think about the square footage of the house that your grandfather went to school in. Think about the schoolhouses, right? Think about the size of the house that, your grandfather was raised in. That's one generation. I mean, my dad lived in a 1-bedroom house till he was 17 years old.
Yeah. My dad tells stories about sleeping in the same bedroom as his grandparents.
Of course, right?
Till he was in his teens,
Right. Yeah. Like the size of the bed, I often say this, that, my grandparents slept in. You had to knock down, shoot them out. You had to figure your stuff out, right? My personal husband and we got a king size bed. I don't even know where he is most of the time. And so that affords the less opportunities. And so if you think, even kids moving from classroom to classroom to classroom to classroom, we don't want them to get too connected to their EA. Why? What's the fear? They're going to get too connected to them. Right. So then we use that EA to foster other connections. Right? What does it mean if I have a favorite teacher? What does it mean? And you just think about like the accessibility to, I mean, again, this gets me back to like, coaches and, your capacity to forge relationships with the secretary, with the bus driver. Relationship knows no hierarchy. And when you're custodian, some of the greatest regulator in the building of schools are custodians, right? They see them running and they're like, whoop, just a second. I got them. And we're really moving into a phase right now where all hands on deck become such a critical understanding, but they also need to know that all of those hands matter. All of those hands are equally as important in doing the thing that we're trying to do for kids, which is regulate them and teach them that they're not alone. Right? Vivek Murthy is the Surgeon General, or was the Surgeon General of the United States of America. Some of the greatest work I think that has come out of the last 5 years has been his stuff on loneliness, and extra supported by Jonathan Haidt's work, The Anxious Generation. Because what drives anxiety is loneliness. When you have to spin in your own head, and I don't know if anybody cares about me, and I'm constantly comparing myself to everybody on TikTok and Instagram, and I'm not playing outside and regulating my system. It makes sense to me. Like this isn't complicated. And so the horse is out of the barn. It's going to become very difficult to sort of go back. But what we do is we reverse engineer that. I mean, we thought smoking was good once. We were smoking on planes not all that long ago. And then we're like, oh, shoot, look at the data. Bad choices. So then we've implemented policies that then allow for the safety of people. And this is going to be true in the space of social media. No phones in schools makes absolute sense to me. I'm a massive proponent. You know who I don't think should have access to phones either? Teachers. And if safety is an issue and you have a phone that you need to call the office because you need to do all those things, absolutely. Yeah, we'll maintain
Always
those
had
things.
that PA system.
Yeah, you got it. But we are not that good. Early child care providers. I talk a lot to daycare staff often and after school care providers, some of the most important people in the lives of humans. And we are not that good to not stay connected to the little box that has everything that matters the most to us in our pockets. So if I get a notification from my dad, when I do a talk, I always have to take my watch off, my Apple Watch, because if I see that it's my dad who's in the end stages of dementia, or my 3 babies when, maybe Aaron's not home yet, or I don't know where, it doesn't matter who I'm serving. They're not as important to me. I'm just not that good. And neither are you and me. And so if we have to remove those barriers, otherwise we won't do it. I mean, we know we shouldn't watch Yellowstone till 3:00 in the morning. We know we shouldn't put on another episode of Dateline, as we relax in the evenings. We know that. We're not that good. So there needs to be the interference. People say this to me all the time. I just really don't like people. You know what I'd really like to do? I'd like to go to a cabin in the woods where nobody could get me and there's no Wi-Fi. Like, do you know you could shut your phone off? Like, do you know that?
Yeah, it's an interesting. That's a really interesting point. And Gina, please feel free if you've got another question you want to jump in, because solitude is also so important, right? But I think we would talk about it in a different way here, right? Like intentional solitude, the kind of solitude that is produced by the literate experience, which is yourself, a book, an exploration. But the purpose of that solitude is always to come back to the community better, refreshed, right? So I think that's a great way to think about it.
I think if we have an authentic sense of a place we belong, a place we're safe and loved, we're safe in those moments of solitude. I'm totally worried about people who don't have a place where they feel like they belong. I was talking to the head of the ARC, the Alberta Adolescent Recovery Center, and in 33 years of operation, the number one thing that all kids who are addicted had in common, all graduates through their program, was they didn't fit in, they didn't belong. And so I think this is the core of all the mental health and wellness and well-being. So I love always Jody's message. I do have a question about also the teachers. How do we help the big people feel seen as well, so that they can help support the little people in feeling seen?
You drastically shift funding. On a macro level, that would be my first thing. We when I say to any divisional leader, and this is across North America, help me understand what you do for kids. Well, everybody got a Chromebook. We've invested in Leader in Me and Zones of Regulation. We got all these kind of programs. We bring in the magician once a month, and we have like assemblies, and like some guy, I don't know, pulls stuff out of, makes balloon animals. It's so exciting, whatever. Oh my God, this is amazing. All these beautiful things. And we have safe spaces for kids to land, and we have sensory rooms, and we've invested Okay, cool. Oh my God, so good. What do you have in place for your teachers? Well, we do a potluck. Holy shit.
Sandwiches.
Nothing says you matter like bring your own food. Okay? So there's a way of operating in the system that believes we are serving kids, which is so true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that kids first, kids matter. Like those are the mantras of many school divisions. Okay. And I'm glad because my children, the three most important people in our world attend public school. And I'm very grateful for it. Some of the greatest experiences they will ever have is in the moments of laughter with their teachers. I say this to my kids all the time. Who's your favorite teacher? And they always tell me, the twins tell me anyway, it's Mr. Seeley. And they had him 5 years ago. I said, why? Why Mr. Seeley? Because he had a turtle. That's it. He had an amphibian.
It's the
like
best.
They're not like he was the greatest literary, So I also know Mr. Seeley is very loved in our community. He has a great group of people who are really committed and connected to him that, when we were the parents of the kids in his class, it was really the focus of us to bring him stuff and snacks and to give him all the things to remind him he's amazing. Because the truth of kids, and when I wrote Kids These Days, this was really the point. Like when you're acknowledged, you rise. And we've known this about kids and emotional regulation for a really long time. When I speak to teachers, the slide deck doesn't change. When we understand the importance of acknowledging them, they rise. And what I say to teachers all the time is the unfortunate part is we are not going to live long enough for probably the government or the big shooters to understand this drastic shift that I think will have to happen over the next couple of generations, particularly as people get more dysregulated. The only thing we have control over is you and me doing the next best right kind thing. And when I feel overwhelmed, I'm like, it's leadership. It's the lack of funding. I only have EAs. There's too many or not enough EAs. There's not even too many IPPs, whatever the deal is. And I say, okay, listen to me. Here's what we need to do. This is the number one trick. And we'll talk about this at the summit too, is really how do we get back into our own bodies? We spend a lot of time with our shoulders up. Uncertainty, fear, no end in sight, the three components to the most dysregulated among us. So if I look at a kid who's just flipped his lid every single day, all day long, uncertainty, fear, no end in sight, that's what's living in his body, I promise you, or their body. If you think about this as an adult, like if you've ever heard the word cancer in your family system, uncertainty, fear, no end in sight, there's your shoulders, okay? Housing insecurity, financial insecurity, any of those things. COVID, uncertainty, fear, no end in sight, this goes here. What happens then in my dysregulated body is I don't lose my ability to be great. I lose access to it. So I maybe once was the best teacher. I once did this to make a difference. I loved the kids. I enjoyed the laughter. But when I am like this, I lose my ability to do those things. So if I were to reverse engineer that, it doesn't mean we need more training or support or any of those things. That won't matter if we're still all in dysregulated bodies. And we will be PS because we're strapped to an Apple Watch that is giving us buzzes of cortisol, right? The Team Snap notifications that are happening here, every email that I get, the mixed text messages, 16 messages from my daughter saying, I don't know where my agenda is. None of those things calm my nervous system. And then when I'm sitting in front of a computer, I'm getting notifications all day. Our parents didn't experience this, not one time. We're the first generation. And then when we take a break, we're looking at social media. Also, nothing good lives there. Okay. So there's also not going to be anything there that's going to calm my nervous system. It's going to be like, oh, she's working out already, that bag. Oh my, why didn't I? We need family pictures. Like, so you're like this all day. And then you drive home and you listen to a podcast because you're not good enough. So then you do that. And then you get home and you're supposed to frolic with your children and you don't even like them. And then you try to go to sleep and you watch Dateline just to relax. Some murder in Tallahassee, So the reverse is true. It would be to do this on purpose. Drop your shoulders. Drop your tongue from the roof of your mouth. It's the most primitive response to stress. And so that's what, we're going to talk about this at the summit, but this will be my number one direction. You matter more than your teams and the people you serve. So it is a direct switch in terms of our priorities. You and the people you go home to, you, your teams, and then the people you serve, the kids you serve, in that order. That's what matters.
There's a good amount of this audience are superintendents, like, the folks you're going to speak with and work with in Vancouver School Board, and ed tech leaders. What are do you have some real just practical kind of advice for them on how to structure whether it be teacher pro D that doesn't feel like, we're going to be lectured about assessment of learning, assessment for learning. Is there something else that we can be doing that you would suggest to them to really be thinking long and hard about, or to be implementing?
Yeah, consider taking a big break from teaching teachers what to do in their job and teach them how. So again, it's exhausting, I think, talking again about, curriculum, literacy, numeracy again and again. Like, I understand, like, we all want to get better at the craft of our respective business. But I think some of the smartest organizations in the world do a very good job of focusing on the humans. Because the most important work, an Indigenous leader taught me this up in the Yukon 2 weeks ago. She said, "Do you know who the most important people are that you work for?" And I said, "Tell me." She said, "The ones you go home to." And if we can have a Pro D day that really reminds us of that, I mean, this is why I love to do Pro D every day, all day, because it's so easy to get us back to why we do this stuff. When we sink into the top 3 kids, for example, that you'll never forget. The ones who remembered your birthday, the ones that made you like were the life-sucking Cailloux and you like wanted to throw punch them, or the ones that, maybe even the ones who died, right? I promise you, if you can get them in your head right now, they or their families think about you 10 times as much, right? If you only knew. It's holy work. It's holy work. Educators will spend more waking hours with my children than I will in the run of a school week. They are the greatest investment in the next generations to come. Because if they're not okay, our babies don't stand a chance.
If you had a magic wand, what would you do to the education system? You mentioned funding, but this wand doesn't end at funding, Jody. You can do whatever you want. What would you do?
Oh my gosh, I got so many ideas, but I loved, Gina's initiative, talking about the mental health focus. I think that I am much more interested in becoming trauma integrated in the way that we practice, not just trauma informed. And so the questions around integration of trauma means that we are going to have to very clearly understand engaging with staff and students and their families from a neurophysiological perspective, which means creating a safe space, creating safety within the bodies in which we are teaching and housing and serving and all of those things. So if we are continuing to ask questions about motivators and triggers, we're likely missing the mark. Because what I'm looking for is not what is wrong here. How am I going to keep this kid quiet? I want to know how we're going to keep this kid calm. And that doesn't mean that we are trying to get them to be quiet. In fact, we want to plan for when they're not, which is a bit of a shift in how many of us have been raised. And not just, this isn't a problem of the education system. This is not a problem. This is the response that the justice system has engaged in. Every major institution adheres to the behavioral model, which is you make a good choice, I reward you. You don't make a good choice, I punish you. So that's the fundamental underpinning of the justice system, of education, of the parenting philosophy all of us were raised in. Many of us were raised in. I shouldn't say all of us. Many of us were raised in. Corporate America operates in this way. You hustle harder, you get rewarded for it. You're lazy, you're weak, you don't. And that problem with the strict behavioral model is it came from a place where we had one thing in this universe that we no longer have, and that is proximity to each other. When you employed a strict behavioral model, even just one generation. So if you've been teaching for more than 15 years, I often, ask this question, are kids different? Do the students you teach look different than they did 10 years ago, 15 years ago? And the answer resoundingly is yes, right? They're more, depending on who's in the room, but like often it's like, their attention spans are shorter. They're less resilient. They're more anxious. They're they're much more disrespectful. They don't want to work. They're lazy. They're all these kind of things. Okay. And so I say, oh my gosh, like this sounds like a big deal. And then I say, have you noticed any change in parents these days? What do you notice about the big people? Well, they're very distracted. They're exhausted. They're overwhelmed. They're overscheduled. There's no time for rest. Sundays used to be a day of rest. No longer. We have 16 hockey games. Oh, shocking. Okay. So we have a very dysregulated group of parents who are hilarious and funny. Their babies are struggling too. So the issue isn't the kids. I've assessed and treated over 1,000 kids in this country. Not one time have I met a bad one. Not one time. I meet increasingly dysregulated children. That's who I meet. And at the Children's Hospital, I mean, we would see ACEs scores of 9, 10 in every baby that came through, ages 4 to 18. And, lots of, very few corrective experiences on board. And so the question then becomes, how do we create systems in which there are more corrective experiences, because we can't control what happens in the trauma space. So our biggest job is, are we providing a sense of safety and connection and security, and an understanding that emotional dysregulation isn't the problem. How we respond to it is what matters. And if I'm responding to it by saying things like, you're not making good choices, you're in the red, you're suspended, all of which might be helpful in some state, at some point. But the idea is what I do with that, and when I teach, that becomes really critically important. And so I think, Gina, the wellness initiative, this understanding of sort of moving that voice to the head of the table. I've been working with institutions across North America, educational institutions, and I've seen a very slow shift from, the parameters, their focus. Mental health never even made the list before. And now, it's certainly behind literacy and numeracy. Mm-hmm. And relationships would be there because that's cute, but there's really no reflection then of in the way that they operated, or what. Help me understand. I would say, when you catch a kid vaping in the bathroom who's 12, all right, we know bad choices. You can't vape on school property. Got it. So policy would say, I'm going to suspend that kid. Okay, cool. So you're going to send him home for a couple of days. What do you think is going to happen during those 2 days? When you suspend this guy, what do you think is going to happen? He's just going to go home and do some deep breathing, or maybe some reflection. And they're like, well, no. And I said, well, help me understand, right? The data is clear. So suspension is a pipeline to prison if there's no intervention. Okay. So there's no support during the suspension, no reintegration back after you leave the school property for a couple of days. Help me understand why we still are using this where there's no data to support it. And Grace Murray Hopper said this. She's one of my my mentors. And she was the first admiral in the US Navy. She said the most dangerous phrase in the human language is, it's always been done this way. And so we are now, Adam Grant says this, we're playing by a set of rules that was established for a world that no longer exists. We are, as big people, overwhelmed, exhausted. There is no time for our educators to refuel, because their students, their staff, their administrators can get them anytime. The body keeps the score. Before we even pee, we're checking our emails. Right? We go home. We're supposed to leave school property at 4:45 or whatever. It doesn't matter to me, whatever the number is. Who leaves the property at 4:45? And then your little phone's in your pocket, attached to all the emails. And you just, because we're caring people. When you serve other people's children, I want to make sure they're okay. I'm thinking about them at night. I'm losing sleep over other people's babies. I'm doing all these things. I've never met an educator who hasn't. They're some of the finest humans on the planet. And our biggest job is just to look after them a little bit better, I think, so that they have more access to those good stuff. That's all.
Absolutely. And our educators and our leaders there too, because I know our leaders are struggling well as, of course, right? our teachers. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the relationship knows no hierarchy. So what's really critical to me is, like, do not underestimate your power as an EA or a bus driver to go to your superintendent's office, or as a bus driver to walk in and say to the principal, I got to tell you, I'm really happy to work here. You're doing a great job. I know I see a lot of people are upset these days, but you're doing it. I love your smile. I love that you're meeting the kids in the bus. Like, do not underestimate your power, right? Because we're feeling as incompetent as parents these days with this new script of technological advances as educators are, as leaders are. Nobody knows. What's the answer? Should we have phones in school? I don't know. Is the vaping bad? Is it good? Should we all vape? What's a TikTok? I don't do it. Right? So like none of us know, and we don't have a script for it. And then that is the most divisive thing on the planet. But the point is, we're never meant to do any of this alone. So I love it when we get to do summits like this, because it really is this sense of bringing people doing this work, the exact same work, together in one place, so that we can start to have those conversations. Because this is happening in every school district, across every province, across every territory, across every state. These same conversations are had, and they're very siloed in the way that they do business.
At the summit, I think we're going to make sure that we have as a priority to feel seen and to really acknowledge one another there, Dr. Jody. I think we'll take that to the summit. We're going to learn, connect, and share expertise, but I also wanted people to come and experience wellness for themselves. So I love your message about self. We have some self practices like a forest bathing expert is going to take people out into the trees to help them with the meditative practice and the healing in nature. We have people who can do meditation, yoga, exercise, and just compassion retreat, all kinds of things, so that I don't just want them to come and to a typical conference. I want them to come, learn, share, connect on a human level that's deep, have impact, so we take it forward and actually make change in our schools and our systems for our kids, parents, and families. But I want them to feel well too, and remember it's important to take care of yourself. So
yeah,
thank
brilliant.
you for being a huge part of that.
I love that, Gina, because again, we can't tell them how to be great. We got to show them. So the biggest focus for me all the time, right, is then like, okay, am I moving my body? Am I drinking my water? Am I doing the things that I need to do to be the best human? And I told this story the other day, like Aaron and I, my personal husband, had a big knockdown, shoot 'em out fight over Olivia wouldn't go to school one morning. And so he's screaming and she's yelling. And then I'm getting a text. Okay. So I'm doing a talk on relationships because I'm the expert. I wrote a book on it. And I got a personal husband flipping his lid. And I got two of my children texting me, said, Dad's losing it. What do we do? And I'm like, okay, clearly I'm going to get divorced. This is the first plan. And then second, like all of the children, like, this is it. Why did I ever become a parent? And I think that we don't understand or we don't talk nearly enough about how difficult it is in this season. And that when it gets difficult, what we want is other people to be doing better things. And what we often miss is the importance of just slowing it down right inside our own bodies. Mm. That is the only thing that we have control over first. And I knew, so when I got all these text messages, this is what I was saying to them this weekend. I was like, my first order of business was to calm down. Because my first phone call was really like, okay, we're getting divorced. I cannot believe that you would speak to our children in this way, which, I mean, I speak to our children this way all the time, but I was really not having it in this moment. And I knew that, okay, I had to remind myself all of the ways that this human is an incredible dad. And that all the ways that these two babies have so much going on. They're 12-year-old twins. Right. My 14-year-old was pontificating how his father should be parenting better, which I'm sure was also very helpful. And so when we get back into that space, right, then there was more room for us to navigate this as parents. And that's often the mistake, we miss all the time, is that if senior leadership would do this, if I wasn't on this person's team, if it wasn't, all of those things may be true. But you will have access to the best parts of you when we settle that in first. And we have to experience it to know what that feels like. So that, all of these opportunities are going to be there at the summit, I think is great. And then integrating that into knowing that, the body keeps the score in this whole system is going to just be so helpful.
Well, I think this has been a fantastic preview for some of the amazing conversations and perceptions and learnings we're going to have at the conference. So Dr. Jody Carrington and Dr. Gina Jarkowski, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jody.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.